great existential questions of life. Who am I? Who are you? These are questions that we ask ourselves throughout our lives, and to be honest, the answers are always changing. Perhaps a better question is, how is this changing? And do we have any sense of control or ownership over this process? When I was studying my dissertation at the University of Essex around consumer behavior and authentic influence, I made it my mission in life to find a way to give consumers a way to get power back over their digital assets. This is why, alongside one of my best friends and co-founders, I started Whisper, an app that allows anyone to get paid to become an influencer and take control over their digital assets and work with brands and advocate them in a way that works for them. And over the last year alone, we've paid tens of thousands of pounds to hundreds of regular people, giving them a sense of ownership over their digital assets. But this hasn't always been the case or been able to fully come to terms. So today I want to talk to you about how attention and the way that we form our identity has changed over time and how this has been and will continue to be driven by technology. But before we go into this timeline, there are two very important things to understand. First of all is the very concept of identity. It's a thing that we all feel that we intuitively understand, and at its most simple, it's knowing who's who and what's what. I know who I am, I know who you are, you know who I am, and I think I know who you think I am, and so on. Identity is a group project. But how do we do this? Well, in modern capitalism, we use consumption as a tool to craft identities. We buy brands that have meanings and we put them onto ourselves. And this requires that we have a really high level of understanding of what any given brand means so that we can be seen to be using it in the right ways. And this is something that we're always consciously and subconsciously analyzing about ourselves and those around us. It's why you probably see politicians always rolling up their sleeves when they go to factories. And all in all, this allows us to use consumption as a way to break free of the pre-existing definitions of identity, things like sex, occupation, class, gender. And then on this process, the second thing we have to understand is how attention works. Now, brands are always there to help us in our identity-seeking process, but first of all, they have to win our attention. Now, this is easier done than said. I did get that the right way around. Brands can hack our minds because we all have the same lizard brains. We basically have a habit and reward system that can be hacked so that they can win our attention. And then when they've won our attention and they've gathered more data about our likes, our dislikes, who we are, and who we want to be, they could be in a place to humanize themselves and their products so that we add them into our identity project. Now, this has created a race to the bottom over the last few years, a race to the bottom to get our attention so that these brands can define who we are and help us. And that's what I'll be talking about over the course of pre-web, Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3. Now, in the days before pre-web, there wasn't very much data available about John and Sam. John and Sam and the people that we'll be using as our examples today. So John grew up in a small village. If I get closer to the button. John grew up in a small village. His identity was largely ascribed to him. It's a product of his birth, and it's mainly formed around his conservative and rich upper-class family. As such, it doesn't really change that much. It's quite stationary and unflexible. And next up, we have Sam Smith. Sam grew up with a family with very relaxed values, and over the course of his life, he's been able to build his sense of identity. And in the pre-web days, there wasn't very much data available at either of them. So brands had to lean on what we built our identities upon, and that's a sense of subculture and counterculture. Some of these are the most powerful in the UK. You've got the likes of punks in the 70s or new romantics in the 80s. And if you're wondering what a new romantic is, here's a picture of my mum. Doesn't she look fantastic? She built her sense of identity over time. She had to go out and buy clothes. She had to make a lot of the clothes that she couldn't buy. She had to buy the right magazines, consume the right TV programs and the right albums. And then she'd have to go to specific places to show off this sense of identity. She'd have to go to places like the Blitz Club in London. That's why she's known as a Blitz kid. Now, for brands, this meant that they could lean on these countercultures to put their brands into our identity projects. This required compelling and really good storytelling and really good adverts, and it led to products like Dr. Martens, the original punk boot. And this gave birth to the golden age of ad men. Sam's free to become a punk and show punk-like things in any way he wishes, but John isn't. Maybe that's because he's adopted the family values that his family have put upon him. Or maybe it's because he feels like he can't break free and wear them because he might be punished for breaking out of the mold. But then came along Web 1. And Web 1 is basically what they call the read-only web. Now, the read-only web is basically like a book or a magazine or encyclopedia. That's all you can do. It's got limited interaction. It's decentralized and built on open protocols, but all of that's quite technical. So this is a time where it wouldn't really affect John and Sam that much because they probably wouldn't be using it. They were more likely affected by things like MTV, who gave them culture in their living room. But in the early 2000s, some really clever people at Facebook and Google created Web 2, and aspects of Web 2. They basically wrapped these decentralized protocols with easy-to-use interfaces that allowed anyone to be able to use them. They can create profiles, share messages, upload photos, basically everything we do on the web today. This allowed Sam and John the ability to experiment freely. Sam could dive in and out of new subcultures and try things at a moment's notice, but more importantly, so could John. John was finally free to experiment with who he was, and he didn't have to worry about his family or lack of money from inhibiting him from doing so. But as we know, all free things come at a cost. In the case of Sam and John, they became the product. It's their data that was collected for these free services, which is then sold on, or they were sold hyper-targeted adverts. Now, over the last few years, this has become increasingly insidious. Products and algorithms have been created who are designed to attack those subsystems of the brain, the reward and the habit systems. And they hire attention engineers whose sole purpose is to implore principles from casinos into your phones. Now, this is so effective that studies have shown that the more you use your phone, the more fragmented your attention becomes. So if you find yourself picking up your phone and then opening an app and closing it only to opening it again, that's because they've done their job well. So if anyone's dropped off on my talk so far, it's not my fault, it's your phone's. So what has this done? It's created a universe in a world where a few select people and a few select companies know John and Sam more intimately than they know themselves. They know their likes, they know their dislikes, they know who they are, and they know who they want to be. And the effect of this over time means that subcultures have become integrated into culture, and it's made culture more homogeneous, and subcultures more fragmented. It's not to say that they don't exist. They do. It's just that their physical manifestations are in decline. And that's partly because they're so easily accessible, and there's no real cultural imperative to invest anymore. Unlike my mum, they don't have to go out and do all of these things to become a punk. They can buy clothes, and then they're a punk the next day for Amazon, or they can consume punk-like culture by going on YouTube or Netflix or Spotify. All in all, this has assimilated these subcultures into wider culture at a much faster rate than ever before. And you have words like fam and like yes queen are a part of wider culture because we're so used to watching like RuPaul's Drag Race and all these programs. There's no barriers to entry anymore. And for a modern generation, this has created a world where they use these fringes of subculture to build their identities. It's no longer cool to be part of a group anymore. It's cool to be individually you. And perhaps the best example of this is a guy called Francis Bourgeois. I don't know if anyone knows him, but he's known as the train guy on Instagram. So he's a train spotter, and he's become famous for it, and he loves it, and this is his hobby, and this is part of his identity. It's unique. It's something that probably wouldn't have been cool maybe 10, 15 years ago, but now it is. He has deals with Gucci, he's friends with Joe Jonas, and he flies all over the world. He is uniquely himself. But this has created a problem for brands. Where they once relied on these subcultures to integrate products, they now rely on data, and they rely on automation. And only a few of these key players in the tech world have this information freely available. And over time, we as consumers have become less and less trustful of these adverts, and they've also become more expensive for the brands that run them. So this has led to a world where brands are now co-opting us as consumers and content creators in the same way that used to co-opt these countercultures. So they're using platforms and startups and agencies like mine, Whisper, because we can connect them to influencers and us as consumers and create content that's more trustworthy, because we as people have our fingers on the pulse usually way more than a brand can. A perfect example of this is TikTok. Has anyone here tried to make a TikTok before? It's really hard work. It's really time-consuming, and TikTok doesn't really care about who you are. It doesn't care how many followers you have, how much money you have. It cares about one thing, and that's good content. And that's really, really hard for brands to make, especially if they don't have their fingers on the pulse. This has created a world where now Instagram and TikTok are actually fighting for us as consumers and content creators. They're launching billion-dollar funds that keep us incentivized to be on the platform. But what's the relevance to John and Sam here? Well, this is an indication of what's to come. We're going towards an increasingly consumer-led marketing world, which cares about us and our data rights. Influencer marketing, for example, is a $16 billion industry alone, and by 2025 is expected to be worth $52 billion. But where this gets really exciting is Web3. Now, there's no widely agreed upon definition of Web3, but what it does represent is decentralized protocols that allowed for the building of things like economies and platforms that no single entity controls. So John can be free to post about what he likes without worrying it's going to be taken down, and Sam can be free to send money to his friends without the need for a bank. Now, where Web3 kind of has its best innovation is Web2 made us the product. Web3 will make us the content owner, so we'll be taking some of the power back. A small caveat, though, I'm not here to say if this will happen, when it will happen, or how it would technically happen, because that's a whole different kettle of fish. But what I am here to say is how this could be really beneficial to us as consumers. And perhaps one of the best examples of this is gaming. So there are games out there at the moment like Axie Infinity, and what they allow you to do is download the game and play it. And as a player, you get rewarded for playing the game. You get tokens. These tokens can then be chipped in for cash at any point. This creates a symbiotic relationship whereby you and the brand are entwined. If you invite more friends and advocate for the platform more people come on. The more you play, the better the brand does. And the brand's incentivized to look after you, the consumer, and the content creator, because the more features it adds and the more it actually goes to your requests, the better it will do. It creates a symbiotic relationship where both succeed. So perhaps this will help create a world where consumers are no longer viewed as just another number in a spreadsheet or a database, but more as something that are looking for the same thing as brands are. And a really powerful sentiment where this comes in is privacy and the exchange of information. So in Web3, you can create wallets like MetaMask that are available at the moment. And these store all your personal identifiable information. They store your cryptocurrencies and a lot of the data you go onto these platforms with. Now, what's really powerful is you don't have to log in and create all these various profiles anymore. You can just use your wallet. And that protects your information. And that also means that you can give this information out in return for tokens, again, which can be incentivized. And if you want to cut off that access to your data anymore, then great, it's just like canceling a direct debit. You're in control, you get rid of it. Well, this is especially powerful for Sam and John, is the fact that they are no longer going to be tracked. And the tracking ability of brands and platforms will be increasingly harder. So if John wants to access things that his parents might not approve of or his government might not approve of, then that's no problem. He can do this in full freedom. This becomes really powerful in places like Metaverses. Metaverse is a term that many of us have probably heard of, but what does it mean? Well, a metaverse is simply a 3D rendering of the web, or it's a virtual interactive experience that can be accessed by any mobile device, and it can be augmented reality or virtual reality compatible as well, so you get a really more immersive experience. You might be thinking of Facebook, because they recently changed their name to Meta, but they didn't create these. Metaverses have been around for ages, and again, one of the best examples is gaming. So things like Minecraft, Fortnite, these are games that are out there, and they're allowing the younger generation to create these fully achieved digital identities, free from their physical ones. Younger consumers are spending hundreds of millions a year on decking out their characters with skins and customizations that make them unique to them online. Now, if you think that Web 2 really increased the imperative to work on your identity, and really increase the assimilation of subcultures into wider culture, imagine what Web3 will do. You can become anything you want at a push of a button. You no longer have to wait around anymore. John can be free to break out to become whoever he wants. That's really powerful. You might be thinking this is a little bit dystopian at the same time, because who wants to spend their whole life online? Well, think about John. He might live in a world where he can't be who he wants. He might not be able to afford to be who he wants. Or think about Sam. Sam might not be able to go to events because he can't afford them, or he might not be able to see family members all around the world. In Web3, they don't have to worry about this. They can instantly change and take part in these subcultures. Now, Web2 is under threat, and Web3 is under threat, and it's under threat by the existing incumbent players of Web2. They're building metaverses that are their own, and this acts as a threat to us and our rights for data of the future. And they're not only just inventing these new metaverses, they're inventing ones that are driven off hardware that they're creating. So they're effectively hedging their bets. So what can you do with all this information as consumers in the meantime? Well, in the short run, you can think about your attention and where you spend it and your data. You can put your phone down and only pick it up consciously. You can browse in private. You can stop listening exclusively to ads and listen more to your friends and your communities that you care about, because they're the ones that have your best intentions at heart. But in the long run, you've got a choice. Do you go for a Web3 world, which is valuing privacy and your data rights and your ability to become a breakaway character free of your physical world? Or do you go for a rewrapping of the status quo, Web3, which is really Web2 rebranded? That's up to you, the consumer. You have the power, not only with where you spend your money, but where you spend your attention. Thank you.